Good morning. So my name is 1305, and I'm going to talk about the history of chocolate today. Okay. And what I'm going to start off with, or what I'm going to do, is give you a real snapshot of a very complex, richly layered subject. Not just the history. I could talk just about chocolate in modern culture today and talk about it for a couple of hours. What I'm going to present to you today is about a 45-minute, again, snapshot of chocolate. And I have also taught this class at Sonoma State University in the Lifelong Learning Program, Sac State, and given numerous talks about chocolate over the last 13 years. It's been a complete cultural transformation in the United States in regards to chocolate and our relationship to it. So I'm going to go fast. I'm going to show you about 35 slides, and I'm going to repeat some at the end. I've changed my format just a little bit because I want to see how that works. I'd like to ask you to hold your questions till the end, if you would be so kind, and then we'll have a really great Q&A session. And I also want to see, have any of you taken my class at Sonoma State? I had about 30% of people were from Oakmont. So that's good. So you're a brand new audience. You won't see anything you've seen before, probably. And I'm going to start off by passing out some Hershey's chocolates. They're Kisses. Now, I want to, I better just pass these out right away. Thank you.
Okay, now one apiece.
Just one apiece. Now, I did notice I work in QC at Traditional Medicinal Herbal Tea Company in Grayton. Do any of you drink our teas? Really great, yay! Really great teas, yay! But I work in QC, and Hershey's needs to do a little bit of QC work on their Kisses. At any rate, so how many of you grew up with Hershey's Kisses as being your chocolate, or a Hershey's bar? Okay, so was anyone born in the 1920s here? If you care to divulge. Anyone born earlier? Okay, so I asked because I have had the honor of speaking to people, centenarians, particularly way back in the late 90s, who had actually been born around the turn of the 20th century, and to hear their stories about their relationship to chocolate was amazing. So I also collect oral histories about people's experiences with chocolate growing up. In my family, and this is in the 60s, our really special stocking presents at Christmas was an orange and a box of Whitman's chocolates. Now, no one born after the 70s really understands what it's like to get an orange, which was still a really exotic treat for New Yorkers in wintertime in the 60s, and a box of chocolates. I mean, it was like everything you wanted the stocking to be. And today, I don't see that same, or maybe I'm sentimental, but I don't see that same attachment or importance with food that we saw even when I was a kid, because my grandmother was she was a World War II widow, raised 2 kids by herself. She was very, very thrifty. And we didn't get, I'm talking to Californians. Well, C's, I was thinking more of the oranges. You all are used to oranges. We were not. I mean, they had to get carted up from Florida. Anyway, I had never realized that before. Pardon me?
Not from Providence either.
And not from Providence, Rhode Island, where my newest friend hails from. It's a lovely town. I used to live in Fall River.
Oh.
So we're going to talk about chocolate now. And I want to tell you that I got into this as my postdoctoral research. I have a degree in the ethnobotany of the Maya, and I did my degree at University of Texas at Austin. And I was able to secure a really, really fabulous postdoc at Berkeley in the Department of Anthropology, and I worked with archaeologists. And I started studying the archaeological ethnobotany of plants. So I became interested in the intellectual presence, so to speak, or history of chocolate, and I am not a chocolate eater. When I was a kid, I would shovel it into my face and I didn't care what kind of chocolate it was. But today I eat it very occasionally. I can only eat a little bit of it at a time. I have an allergic reaction to it. But mostly my joy comes from your joy. And I have found that chocolate is one of the most fascinating foods and subjects in the whole world to talk about. I can address economics, politics, history, botany, chemistry, medical research, emotions, memories. The sky's the limit. I never would have ever expected that it was such a rich subject. And so what I'm going to try to do today is to give you a hint of that and entice you to read more about chocolate or go on chocolate tours, which I also do lead on occasion. And they're lots of fun too. So, chocolate is originally from the Americas, and most people don't realize that because we are so distant from the production of our food that we don't really get an opportunity to think about where chocolate came from. And I'm going to be showing you some details about that in just a few minutes. But first I want to start off with a list of really common foods that we are very, very familiar with in this country and show you that they are in fact from the Americas as well. So when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean and then subsequently his sailors went over to the Yucatan and to Mexico, and Cortez invaded with the conquistadors, we're all pretty familiar with that story. They encountered chocolate beans for the first time, but they didn't taste chocolate until around 1519, just before they invaded Mexico itself. So what I want to say is the indigenous people of the Americas, they did not have any domesticated animals except possibly the turkey. They did not possess the wheel. They did not possess any of the transportation routes or technologies that Spaniards were used to or had been familiar with. But look at how these are so insinuated into our culture today that we don't even really think about them too much. The original source of medicine for combating malaria was from Brazil, called Jesuit's bark. Pumpkins, which today, as you know, we not only eat, but we use them for decoration. Rubber. Even in World War II, when our supply lines to the Pacific were cut off and our rubber sources from Asia, the United States government sent a secret mission with the first ethnobotanist in to go bio-piratize, if you will, the Brazilian rainforest looking for rubber sources so that they could make wheels for airplanes for the invasion of Japan. Very, very dramatic stuff. It can get kind of soap operatic too, and and we'll find that with chocolate as well. But I just love this list. I think it's really great for us to know where our food comes from. Now, I'm going to just show you a couple of slides really quickly. This slide is from 2011, and it's a really quick window into what kind of resources were available on the web if you were to do a quick search. Now, you probably heard this week that this is only the 10th year that the internet's been out. Is it 10th? Did anyone else hear that? The internet's been around for 20 years. Perhaps the Google and these search engines have only been around for 10, and yet they've revolutionized my life as a researcher. So Sonoma County Library Do y'all have a library here on campus? Well, that's really nice that you do. I didn't go to your library database, but Sonoma County had 852 hits for chocolate-related titles. The one that was really impressive, of course, was Google, clocking out at nearly 600,000. And WorldCat, which is a database that brings together data from different libraries, had surprisingly only this many chocolate entries. And today, Sonoma County Library, 2 years later, has almost double the number of titles related to chocolate. And one could wonder if that's because people are really getting into chocolate. Are people writing about chocolate more frequently than they used to? Did Sonoma County just get a whole bunch of funds to buy chocolate books? Who knows? WorldCat has increased only slightly. And the last two entries for Google and Bing, they've actually decreased, which I find really interesting. How do you decrease in the number of Google hits? Well, there's a whole algorithm associated with how many hits you get. But chocolate's ever more popular every year, so I just think that's kind of strange. But this is merely to demonstrate there's a lot of information about chocolate out there, and it can be very overwhelming. So what I'm going to try to do is lay out a path for you to follow so you can kind of get a sense of chocolate today. Am I okay here?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're from the United States. We're very privileged people. We don't have to grow our own food. We can afford to buy chocolates. We can afford to take care of or to procure the foods that we like. And we're finding increasingly that chocolate actually has advantages for our dietary health if we eat the right kind of chocolate. What I've shown you here is chocolate in the form most of us are familiar with as a confection, as a chocolate bar, and very importantly, as a solid, because solid chocolate bars were not invented until the 1860s. There wasn't the know-how for chocolate chemistry that permitted people to eat it in a really transportable, compact bar. People used to drink it as a beverage. So some of the forms in which we find chocolate today are as breakfast drinks. Would never drink chocolate for breakfast myself, but I drink coffee. So raw foodies are really into raw chocolate today. Where I live, Andy's Produce is actually a really good sign of the value that people place on chocolate and the varieties. And they have about 6 or 7 different raw chocolate bars. They refer to it as cacao. When I refer to chocolate, I'm specifically referring to the finished product. When I'm referring to chocolate. And when I refer to cacao, I'm talking about the trees and the raw beans. And perhaps they've gone through some of the fermentation process that gets them towards the processing end. But I'm going to use them interchangeably, and hopefully that won't pose any confusion to you. Also, we find chocolate increasingly used in art, but the frame I'm using, the background for this slide, is actually a very famous piece by Marcel Duchamp, and it's made from chocolate. Chocolate has very serious conservation issues. You can't just put it into a museum archive and hope it'll work or preserve itself. But we also have chocolate as functional foods, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And that's where we actually eat chocolate as a dietary supplement and as a source for medicinal properties. So I'm going to hit you with a subject that's really close to my heart and got me into ethnobotany in the first place, and that was that the people who discovered and who continue to grow chocolate today, primarily for developed first world consumption, and who don't actually eat chocolate themselves very often, are indigenous peoples. Usually these people are very poor. They're people of color. They live in countries that band the equator, and they're also their cultures have had a lot of civil war in the recent past, especially in Africa. There have been a lot of there's been a lot of strife over the years, unlike this country where we've been pretty stable, relatively stable for the last 150 years politically. So we're going to talk a little bit about cultural histories and who the people are who grow our chocolate. And also we're going to talk about the role of environmental factors. And I am going to ask you to consider the lives of the people who grow chocolate. If you're a chocolate addict, this is not a judgment, it's not a condemnation of you or anything like that. I just want to promote that you think a little bit about the repercussions of the kinds of chocolate you eat, and also give you some methods and solutions for choosing good chocolate that does not have a lot of socio-political consequences, or perhaps not as many as others do. And I also had this quote: when eating a fruit, think of the person who planted the tree. If any of you grew up on farms, you probably had grandparents who had planted an orchard and you benefited from it. Maybe your family were fruit raisers in post-World War II. Just you have more familiarity with what it's like to plant for a legacy, perhaps than a lot of people who are my age or even younger, or who live outside of Sonoma County, for that matter. So when we talk about what is cacao or what is chocolate, there are two intermingled factors here. And the first one are the people who grow the chocolate themselves, who harvest it and collect it and maintain it. They prune it. If they have access to fertilizers, they might fertilize it, or perhaps put synthetic pesticides on it, or they might practice organic forestry. And they generally tend to be very poor. Cacao is actually a cash crop. It provides really valuable income to families. It's often grown on small farms of about 12 hectares, which is about 10 acres or less, not on giant big farms, because those are not as common in the countries that grow them as in others. And cacao also requires tropical rainforest. So we're always going to find that cacao grows in an equatorial band, and I'm going to show you a map in just a little bit. Has anyone been to the rainforest here? Has many of you traveled to Costa Rica or to South America? So some of you know the rainforest is a wet place most of the time. It has really, really high species diversity of plants and animals and insects. And it tends to be a very close, moist place. It's not for the faint of heart. I've worked in the rainforest for 20 years, and I'm done with it. I've had enough of it. It's very oppressive at times, even though it's really beautiful and fantastic at the same time. So a very well-managed chocolate plantation will in fact replicate the rainforest in the structure of the property. It will have a high canopy of trees that provide shade and protect from overexposure to rain or wind or storms. And then it might have a middle canopy where the chocolate trees themselves are. They can be about anywhere from 15 to 25 feet high. And usually underneath we have a really thick litter of cacao leaves, sometimes this thick. And the policy was in the 60s and 70s and 80s was to clean this up, rake all those leaves out of the way, keep it really well pruned, make it look like a parkland, like we're used to in this country. Well, what they discovered as a consequence of clearing the fields or the orchards was that the production of fruit dropped dramatically. And finally, the first scientist came along, Alan Young, in the 70s and 80s, and he studied cacao orchards in Costa Rica. And what he found was they were reliant on one species of insect, to pollinate the flowers. And they lived in the litter, in the leaves that had been raked away. That's where they bred, that's where they had their babies, that's where they lived, and that's also where their food source came from. So a really brilliant question from a scientist had been asked, about the pollinators, and it has led to a revolution in our understanding about what makes a good chocolate orchard. And these pictures are a little bit hard to see, but this one in particular is shows you that there are some layers here. We have some gingers, here is a cacao tree, and here are some trees that are called Madre de Cacao, the mother of cacao. And over here you can see that it's quite dark, and here's a picture of litter in this particular orchard. So, oh, I forgot I had this picture here. So you can see a little bit more clearly here. So where did cacao originate? Well, it's really hard to squash yourself into a really, really small crucible of thinking about this. But imagine that there's just this one little container, and it happens to sit over Mexico and Central America. This is where chocolate, today one of the world's most popular, most highly produced crops, originated, was in this really small geographic area. And this is where I've done some of my studies as well. These green marks actually signify former sort of hothouses of cacao sources for the Aztec and the Maya, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes. But what I want you to understand here, that this is the equivalent of if chocolate originated in the state of Rhode Island, for instance, maybe New England. That's where it came from, that's where it developed, that's where it was domesticated, that's where it was almost lost as a species, as a source species for chocolate. And it's also where today we see some of the fastest rates of extinction of the original chocolate varieties that exist in the world. Today they are virtually extinct. So these forests that are marked in green here are areas in which cacao was originally found, and the first places that the Spanish wanted to conquer happened to be these chocolate-bearing production areas. Now, again, we live in a really modern world. We don't really think about how indigenous people related to their environment. We don't really get the opportunity to look at much art. Did anyone see the art of the Maya down at the De Young Museum or the Legion of Honor a couple of years ago? Stunning, just stunning. But Mayan and Aztec art is so significantly different from our own Western art that it's very hard to get into the minds of the indigenous people. But I can tell you that they believed chocolate was so important to their culture, to their politics, to their sense of why they fought wars, to their rituals, to their religious offerings, to their royal paraphernalia. Chocolate was an intrinsic part of their culture at every step of the way. And I'm talking about 1,500 years at least that we know of, that chocolate was present in really significant visual ways in Central American and Mexican art. And I'm going to show you just a handful of the most famous and most beautiful artifacts that exist. This pot here is perhaps the most famous pot. It's called sometimes the Hershey pot. It is from a town, an old town in Guatemala called Rio Azul. And when it was discovered, it came out from a burial intact, about this high, and it is the first pot to ever have had a twist off manufactured into it. So they have these groins that the potter built in, and they can turn it and actually use it as a sealed vessel. And this site is late, it's about AD 700, so very sophisticated cultural techniques for pottery at that time. But what is painted on it is a blue and then a jaguar pelt on both sides, and then this hieroglyph here is a Mayan hieroglyph, and it was defined, it was translated into English as being the chocolate glyph. And I won't bore you with the details. It wouldn't really mean a lot to you to hear the linguistic details, but basically this series of glyphs here says, this is my chocolate pot and my name is, and it was the name of the fellow buried in the crypt. And there were lots of other artifacts associated with him, but he was apparently nobility, and they sent this the sediment from this pot off to Hershey's experimental lab, and they actually confirmed that it had the signature chemical in it called theobromine. I'm sorry, I just stepped over my own words. The signature chocolate chemical called theobromine was present in here. Now, theobromine does not occur in most plants in the Americas. So they were very, very confident that they had in fact located a pot that had chocolate in it at some point when the offering was made. So this was a huge finding. So there we had correspondence between the hieroglyph and linguistic evidence and the actual contents. And it was really appropriate that they sent it to Hershey's, wasn't it? Because you know, people know Mars, but Hershey's is sort of the, you know, it's like our granddad, you know. And here was this particular scientist discovering that chocolate was in fact still very, very important over 1,500 years ago. This pot here is believed to be an effigy of the cacao god. Now, there is no provenance to this. It was a looted item. The Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City was able to acquire it, but they don't know what, so they don't know where it came from, how old it is, and so forth. But it's covered in cacao beans in ceramic form. So this is thought to be an effigy that they would put an offering into the cacao gods, or perhaps it was a house shrine, we just don't know, but it's a thing of beauty. And also here, this is from a Maya manuscript, and this represents a cacao tree, and I'm going to show you a picture of that later. It's a carbon copy, and this too is over 1,000 years old. And these two figures here are thought to be cacao gods. This is thought to be the old cacao god, and this is thought to be the new cacao god. This fellow here is from Mexico, and this fellow here is from southern Belize, almost into Honduras, right on the the Belize, Honduras, Guatemala border. And they range from being close to 1,600 years old to being as recent as AD 1000, so not too long before the Spanish came. What we do know is that the art history world is full of documentation about the role of chocolate. Chocolate was almost always present in any depictions of kings or queens. It helped to, you know, today how we might seal a deal over a cocktail. Or in the old days, you know, the guys would go out to the bar and they'd bond that way. Well, chocolate was the bonding experience across politics, across cultures, across languages. So what we do know today from the archaeological research that's been going on for just the last 13 years, just since I started in 2000, is we know from further chemical science that the Maya were drinking chocolate as early as 3,000 years ago. We have ceramic shards from Honduras that have chemical signatures of chocolate on them from 1100 BC. So to think, we've only had solid chocolate bars for 150 years. We've only had chocolate as a real confection brought over to Europe for the last 500 years, and yet the indigenous peoples of Central America and Mexico have been drinking it for over 300 I mean, over 300 centuries. It's really phenomenal once you can start getting this view into the historical presence of chocolate. So I showed you the map of Central America earlier, and now I'm going to take you to South America, because what we find is that chocolate actually does occur in the Amazon basin of South America as well, but we've also discovered that it was only the Maya who domesticated it. So what we find is actually a distribution. This is Central America and Yucatan. We find a distribution of the cacao species from here down into this area, but only the domesticated cacao crop comes from this area. When the Spaniards came and they discovered chocolate, they started modifying it with sugar. They added cinnamon and almonds, all these yummy comfort foods that they were familiar with. And even though they thought chocolate was literally, they described it as caca, C-A-C-A, which in Spanish means shit, pardon my language. It means excrement. And they called it caca fuego at first because they thought it looked just, vile and like something you'd want to run away from. But when they saw the Indians drinking it, and they saw them using it with tobacco to seal business deals, to seal political deals, when you're having trade talks or war treaty talks, chocolate and tobacco were always involved. They were sacred. And the Spaniards turned it into a profane beverage. They started taking it out of the context of it being about deals. They drank it because it gave them a lot of energy. They drank it because it had high calories, which they, of course, didn't know about then. They could drink one large goblet of chocolate a day, and they wouldn't have to eat until sundown. So it was claimed. And so we saw the Spanish move away from chocolate as a ritual item into it being part of our regular food items. It was also a festive thing. It was something you gave as medicine to invalids. And as the Spanish and the rest of Europe started increasing their consumption of chocolate, they had to find other sources. So they began to look at South American chocolates, because as they became more familiar with South America, they saw some of the same plants they were familiar with in Central America growing there. And they said, oh, well, nobody here drinks chocolate, but we see it grows in the rainforest here, so we're going to start making these farms, and we're going to start exporting it. And that's just what they did. They started exporting it to Western Europe. And this is very interesting to me. Who do you think was really involved in the first cacao exploration, the first cacao trade and export to Western Europe and to the very countries that had just kicked them out of Western Europe? The Sephardic Jews. They were kicked out of Spain in 1492, and they dispersed all around the world, and many of them went because they had nowhere else to go. They went to the Americas, and they happened to be Jewish, they happened to be mercantilists, they happened to be farmers, all different walks of life. They started exporting the first chocolate back to Europe, back to the country that had just kicked them out. It just astounds me that they would find their niche, and it would be chocolate, which just doesn't really surprise me the more I know about history. So, I talked earlier about chocolate having some specific environmental requirements. I said generally, but specifically what it needs in order to grow and to produce well is a lot of water, really good drainage, and really, really high nutrients, and of course lots of biodiversity around. And the picture here on your right is the Orinoco River, and this is a really perfect bird's eye view of the habitat that chocolate requires in order to grow well. This is a floodplain, so we have nutrients getting distributed from floods through the forest. The water drains away because there's good drainage, and there's a really high nutrient content in the soil. Cacao trees love this, and then they also like a slightly dry period. Now I skipped over this, it's not such an important slide, but it shows you for the most important cacao growing regions in South America. And if you were to try to tap on and piggyback onto some of the genome research that's going on right now in the world of cacao, the most important the genetic pools that they're experimenting with now and studying are in fact from these 4 places. They're considered to be super hotspots for diversity in the chocolate species. So this is just to remind you again of where we started off. Now I've taken you to South America, and now I'm going to take you to chocolate around the world. Chocolate's gone viral. Chocolate's gone global. It was one of the first global foods that I've discovered, more global in some ways than tobacco, more globalized in some ways than coffee. Chocolate has basically infiltrated every country that exists around the equatorial band, or the equator. So that's our home country. Those are the Maya chocolate homelands. Today, we have more than about 40 countries around the globe that grow chocolate. And this is in less than 200 years. It's in less than 500 years. And this, to me, as someone who is trained in biology, and we think about how fast a species develop, to think about how fast a food crop could infiltrate the world market, become one of the most productive and valuable items traded on the international commodities market, is just astounding. What binds all of these places together is the habitat. What binds these places together is a good labor force, good as in plentiful. They'll work for very little, they'll do hard work for very little money. And many of these countries export crops to first world countries. So that there's a long-standing political and economic relationship here that I'm trying to have you maintain in your mind. Because we think of chocolate, I realize I'm saying chocolate's not just a happy item. Chocolate has political implications, and hopefully this won't depress you. It just is what it is. Every one of these countries has its own story that you could investigate to tell you about what role chocolate played there in that country. If you're into history, if you're into biology, or you're just simply into cultural knowledge, it's a really fascinating kind of work to do. Going on chocolate tours of, say, Madagascar might not be everyone's favorite vacation, but I think it would just be fascinating. To me, that's one of my life dreams, is to go to Madagascar and do a chocolate tour. It might probably have to be something I create for myself, because there aren't many people who do this, who take all of this disparate information and try to bring it into one place and be able to describe it to you folks, for instance. So biologically, what is chocolate? What does it look like? Would you recognize it if you were out in nature? No, you probably wouldn't. It's a very odd looking fruit. The Maya call it lagarto, which means alligator in Spanish, and that describes the bumpy ridges. It's kind of a purpley blue football shaped fruit, and it doesn't really look like much, except that it looks like it's an alien species from another planet. These fruit grow directly on the tree. I'll show you in a picture. They don't grow on branches, they just grow directly from the stem of the tree. The flowers are tiny. They're less than the diameter of a quarter. And when I show you the picture of the insect that pollinates them, you'll see how intimate their relationship is size-wise. These are the beans. So we have this hard husk on the outside, and inside, if we cut this in half, we see a bunch of beans in a white, sweet pulp. And when that pulp is ripe, you can actually suck on the beans and get it off. And it's quite tasty. It's a little bit like a smoothie, in the texture, and it's sweeter than sugar to me. It tastes sweeter than sugar. But it also tastes a little bit like cherimoya, if any of you are interested or familiar with that. It's a tropical fruit. And these fruits, these are just 6 examples of fruit that I collected in the old Hershey's hummingbird plantation in Belize in Central America. The Hershey company used to have one of their primary growing plantations very close to an archaeological site where I also worked. In fact, the archaeological site was in the plantation. And it was surrounded by cacao orchards, which seemed really appropriate for a Maya site that was over 1,000 years old. And Tropicana had most recently come in and planted a whole bunch of orange trees around the chocolate trees, and I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of acres. So I went in there, I wanted to know what kind of cacao they were growing. They were growing 17 different kinds. Those people I showed you in photographs, they had to be able to recognize the different variety by sight. They had to recognize whether or not they were ripe, if they were diseased, and so on and so on. And these people were just as qualified as any specialist farmer I'd ever met. And it just really impressed me by how much they knew, and yet they weren't considered to be, scientific. So it was a very interesting experience for me. But what I'm trying to get at here is to show you that just in one row there were more than 6 varieties growing, and they all look different. This one is the size of a football, big, not very pretty. This one, in fact, and this one resemble the wild species the most. And that was part of what my study was trying to get at, was which were the wild ones, which were the more cultivated and domesticated ones, and how much variety is there still left around Central America. Here's the insect. It's less than ½ an inch long. It's more like 4 or 5 millimeters long. It's called, and if you remember those tiny flowers, smaller than a quarter, and this little bird, this little insect rather, it's birding season, I've got them on my mind, having to go in and basically excavate in a maze of a flower and collect its nectar and its pollen, and then fly off to another tree or flower and spread the pollen around. To rely on one species of insect shows you the fragility of the chocolate orchard and the ecosystem. Imagine if that midge got wiped out. It almost did, because they were cleaning up the litter. Imagine if that midge went extinct. Do you ever hear about cacao futures? And you may see every few years there is this threat and warning that cacao is going to become really expensive and chocolate's going to double in price, and you think you can get chocolate now but you won't be able to later. So, and there's sort of this scarcity complex that goes on, but it's a real one. It's based on reality from a biologist's point of view. Anyway, I just find it astonishing that this insect, no bigger than this, could fuel a global industry. It's astounding. So cacao, or chocolate, before it gets into your mouth, into your body, whether you use it as medicine or you use it recreationally, the process of preparing it for making into chocolate bars has not changed. As far as we can tell, it's not changed in 3,000 years. What happens is that as the fruit ripens, it ripens twice over a single year. The workers go out and they collect the ripe ones, they cut the beans out, and they bring them back to a central processing area. And basically, in a very non-glorious sort of way, the beans get thrown into a box. In this case, it's a wooden box. And they are fermented. They're stirred every couple of days. They're covered with either banana leaves or burlap bags. And then when they've fermented for up to 8 days and the flavor of chocolate has actually started to chemically manifest itself, they'll put it on either patios or pieces of corrugated metal. I've seen burlap bags laid out on the sides of roads in Mexico where they dry the beans in the sun. Sun-cured beans are considered to be the higher quality beans, as opposed to them being stirred over a smoker like they do in Belize in the hummingbird plantation. And then finally, if you're a traditional Maya woman, you're going to take the beans, and instead of them being exported to other countries, you're going to bring them back to your hut, and you're going to toast them on a flat cooking item, or it's like a skillet, and you'll roast it and make chocolate for your family that way. And I'm just again going to show you a real quick tour of how traditional Maya women prepare the chocolate. They'll toast it on that comal, or it's like a skillet, and then they'll take a metate and they'll grind it, and they'll grind it, and they'll grind it, and they'll grind it some more, and they'll grind it some more. Sometimes they'll grind it as many as 8 times, especially if it's for a special occasion. It comes out very fine, but it still tastes really gritty. It's not at all like the smooth, chocolatey texture we're used to. But they grow up drinking it this way, and they seem to like it, and it's actually very, very comforting, and it's got lots of mouthfeel, and it's very gratifying. In this scene, this woman is putting cinnamon and black pepper into her mixture, and this woman has just mixed cornmeal. And cornmeal and chocolate are actually really fortifying drinks to have in the morning, especially if it's cold. These they're like gruel, and it's very, it is indeed very fortifying. You can go for a long time without eating if you have one of these drinks in the morning. When the chocolate beans leave the farm where they were processed, they tend to be sent off to the first world or to developed nations where they're actually processed in large plants. And we have here a diagram showing from harvest in the actual orchard to fermenting on site, and then drying also happens there. So this all happens in country. It's fairly primitive, very simple technology. And when we get over into what I think of as, the industrialized nation category, we see a lot more technology being used to process the chocolate beans. And they go through a series of steps to dry them, and then separate the papery husk from them, and then grinding. And has anyone ever taken a tour of a chocolate factory here? I know you have. And San Francisco is actually a really great place to go. Cho Factory down on the Embarcadero has tours of their factory, and I really recommend that you go on one if you can, or talk to me, because I take people on tours too. But it's really fascinating, and you never would have realized how much technology goes into it, despite it being fairly simple still. The real trick to getting a really smooth, lovely chocolate that melts in your mouth, not in your hands, melts in your mouth, and just gives you that sense of well-being and like you've really had a good food chocolate experience, is grinding. Really good companies like Guitar Chocolate, or which is from San Francisco, or European chocolates, their trick is to grind. And some places, especially in the United States, will grind up to 4 or 5 days now, and it makes the tiniest particles. And when you start mixing these in with the ingredients like more cocoa butter, the fat that we'll talk about in a few minutes, you can really taste the difference. So if you can imagine tasting a very gritty, textury chocolate like you would taste in a Maya village, a beverage, and then you think about the hot chocolate that you could get here, even at Starbucks. You used to be able to get really incredible rich hot chocolate. Imagine your experience tasting really gritty chocolate where you're like, yeah, it just doesn't do it for me. And then you have the chocolate you grew up with or you're used to, and it's a really different experience. It all comes from the grinding and by really careful processing today. So the most important process that happens besides grinding in a factory is that they separate out the solid dry material in the chocolate from the butter or the fat. And they in fact will have two products. They'll have the cocoa butter, which you can actually buy now to cook with, which is actually a really good source of fats. And does anyone cook with cocoa butter here? It has a really nice nutty taste to it, and again, it's really healthy. And then the cocoa powder, like we grew up using for brownies and from Hershey's and so forth. And the cocoa butter is incorporated into a lot of supplements, dietary supplements. It's also incorporated into cosmetics and as a binder, and it smoothens out a lot of food when you get into food processing. So, who produces chocolate? Well, the Ivory Coast in Africa, Western Africa, produces almost anywhere from 30 to 40% of the chocolate in the world. But 70% of our chocolate that we consume comes from Africa. And if you know anything about Africa, it's not a really nice place to live right now because of all the civil wars, colonial history, and so on and so forth. But who knows what the greatest complaint is about chocolate grown in in Africa? Anyone? Child labor? Slave labor? There was a huge amount of controversy that came out several years ago about employing children as literally as slaves, and they spent their entire lives, sometimes which were short, on these chocolate plantations. Now, I'm not raising this issue to depress you. I'm raising this issue to tell you that there's a hidden history to chocolate. And even for a while, I was a little dubious about these claims, but having traveled in a lot of tropical countries and seen some really desperate poverty and situations going on, I could believe it. And now I actually think that there's a lot of evidence to prove that in countries where there are chocolate producers like Hershey's, like Mars, like Nestle, who are trying to combat child labor, now that we see the effects of their programs there, I believe that there was indeed really serious violations of child labor going on there. And when we talk about fair trade chocolates, or when we talk about Rainforest Alliance certified chocolates, we're talking about chocolates made by companies that have politically conscientious sources of chocolate. They're sustainably raised. They try to give a good price. They often open up health clinics in communities, and they make education a really important part of these village lives, because they, not only is it politically correct, but if they want to create chocolate producers of the world, they have to educate them. This is the idea, you have to educate them and take care of them. If you create conditions in which they will take up arms and commit civil war against their country, they're not going to be growing chocolate. So it's a very complex situation, again. And it's especially complex because so much of our chocolate is raised in these very countries that are facing really horrible challenges today. This is a table from 2007 or 2008 about the highest, or the countries that produce the greatest amount of chocolates, and Ivory Coast even then led the pack. Ghana was right behind them. Today Ghana is a little bit farther down in this list because of their own civil war. Cadbury's is really active in Ghana. They have been since the early 1900s. So Cadbury has a really strong presence in Ghana, and what they're trying to do too is to put in these sustainably grown orchards and create better lives of the people who are growing them. Brazil used to be one of the greatest producers of chocolate in the world, but they had a terrible outbreak of witch's broom, which is a fungus that attacked almost all of their trees and destroyed them. So, chocolate and medicine. Mars Incorporated as you probably know, is from the United States. They are the leading researcher in the United States and probably in the world on the health benefits of chocolate. Do you remember the Dove bar? And it came out several years ago, and it was one of the first functional foods because it actually had enough chocolate and health-rich chemicals in it that they could actually make a claim that's saying this is good for your heart. This will lower risk of heart disease and so on. And Mars, not only is it a really great marketing strategy for them to look into the research, but it could be something where they could hook up candy and health together. And they're really, really active in investigating these particular properties of chocolate. Does it in fact help to lower cholesterol levels? And there is more and more evidence that it does in fact do that. And in regards to women specifically, can it help to reduce risk of breast cancer? They are just starting out this research, they're not really sure. Can chocolate chemicals also help to be in over-the-counter prescription supplements? And we know that it has antioxidant properties. You probably have all heard that a little bit of dark chocolate is as good for you as a glass of red wine every day. And they're also looking into some of these psychiatric issues associated with getting older, and also just with health in terms of diseases, and whether or not chocolate can participate in your well-being. It can. If it makes you happy, it's going to make you feel better. That's what the doctor says. So right now, the more conventional thought is that dark chocolate is really the way to go. Hershey's chocolate, I just fed you junk food on a Sunday morning. I'm really sorry. But there was a reason for that. It's still inexpensive. It's an icon for many of us. I still look at that and I have really deep childhood memories associated with my first Hershey's Kiss pendant. This gentleman here was telling me about the street lights in Hersheytown. They're all shaped like Hershey's Kisses. You know, there's lots of memory associated with it. But it's not the best chocolate to give you because it's really just sugar. It's not high quality dark chocolate. So the conventional thought is today that you can consume up to an ounce, about a small square of chocolate every day, and get health benefits from it. Dark chocolate has less sugar in it. It tends to have a lot of cocoa butter in it, which is very, very good for our hearts. They help to, those compounds help to lower the bad cholesterol in our blood system. And in fact, it's a very good source of some minerals that we need as we get older, particularly calcium. It does have some protein, but look how much potassium it has. And it does have a little bit of caffeine in it. So you can't really escape that. Oh my God. So last night I thought, oh, I'm going to go see what the latest is on child labor. Well, I can report very happily that Hershey's, which for years and years did not participate in these anti-child labor law activities, is now getting in on the game. So for me, Hershey's is getting better. You know, if you eat chocolate based on political lines, you can trust Hershey's again. I think you can. So I'm just going to skip over that. The chemical that's important in chocolate that you will hear talked about all the time are flavonoids, and their implications for brain health and heart health and body health are really important. And they include these big multisyllabic words, which I don't even really bother to try to retain anymore because the world is just floating in chemicals. And I'm just going to skip along because we have been running out of time. But I want to stress that dark chocolate is full of the flavonoids or flavanols that are very beneficial for your brain. White chocolate does not possess any of these chemicals. Hershey's bittersweet chocolate drops contain a little bit more of these, but we're talking about 75% solids and higher. And we could just do a whole little section on dissecting a label. We in fact do have this as a section in one of my classes. Cacao solids that are now increasingly printed on the labels of high quality chocolate bars are what you want to pay attention to. Let's say you don't really like dark chocolate, but you prefer, semi-sweet chocolate. Anything over 60% is a good start. 75% is considered to be the ideal level for your heart health and your brain health. Those chocolates are a little bit bitter to some people's taste, and I would just suggest that you try a whole bunch of different bars over time. Have chocolate tasting parties. I've done that before. We'll taste 5 or 6 different bars, and everyone's got their own opinion. Everyone's got their own idea about what they can taste, whether it's a fruity taste or a wine taste, or if it tastes like rainforest. There's a whole world out there just tasting. But you can find a bar that you really like, and what you don't like, give away to other people. You will make friends everywhere if you always have a chocolate bar with you. And even I, at work, I'll have tasting parties for my lab mates. And I love listening to what they say, but do I score brownie points by bringing in really good chocolates? The answer is yes. So you can become a social leader through better chocolate eating. But mostly what I want to leave you here with today are just a few slides you've already seen. We've gone from this tiny rink-a-dink geographic area over 3,000 years ago, where they developed a very intimate personal relationship with chocolate that transformed one food into a food of the gods, into a food that allowed them to communicate with their ancestors, that created sanctified space, that created a ritual space, just as if you're a churchgoer or you're a temple goer, and there are certain clues, certain elements that create the ambiance of that sanctified space for you. That was the role of chocolate in Maya and Aztec culture, and it still exists as that way today. But we've taken it and we've made it into this really delicious, profane confection. And to us, it's sort of a source of sugar, but it's also a source of a little bit of an upper, exactly. It gets the endorphins going. For women particularly, we have a very interesting, mysterious relationship with chocolate. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel good when we feel bad, too, which I just find fascinating. So we've gone from that really small area to a whole new growing area once the Spanish got in on the action and started making a profit from it, to now having a global food crop that infiltrates virtually every grocery store, every candy store, every kid's life, even adult lives today. And chocolate is personally significant for many of us, even for those of us who have allergies to it and don't eat it anymore. It's this humble little, not really got anything going for it, rainforest crop. And it has manifested itself in this exquisite art and material culture from past cultures. It's still consumed today in the very cultures that created it. And it's undergone this huge transformation. I haven't even talked about technology in making solid bars. I haven't talked about the courts and the courts and nobility in Europe and the cloak and dagger activities that went on. But that's just to show you how much there is more to tell you. And I'm going to finish here with a poster from Tyson Foods over in Fairfield, where probably your favorite jelly beans are made. Jelly Bellies, right? Reagan's favorite too. And I love this. I have not gone on their tour, but one of my graduate students brought this back to me when I first studied this, and I just think it's precious, so I still have it. I'm going to have to read it to you. So it says, chocolate is a vegetable. Chocolate is derived from cocoa beans. Beans equal vegetables. Sugar is derived from either sugar cane or sugar beets. Both of them are plants in the vegetable category. Thus, chocolate is a vegetable. To go one step further, chocolate candy bars also contain milk, which is dairy. So candy bars are a health food. Combat osteoporosis with chocolate. Chocolate-covered raisins, cherries, orange slices, and strawberries all count as fruit. So eat as many as you want. Remember, stressed spelled backwards is desserts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsten.